Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of BG Sustainability Week webinars. This is practical preparation for retrofit projects, so hopefully you're in the right place, but even if you're not, stick around, it's going to be very interesting. I'm John Milner, and I'm your chair for today's webinar. I'm joined by four great presenters, Elizabeth Hung, who's going to be talking about period and heritage buildings, Ben Nixon, who's going to be talking about strategic asset management, Will Gregory, who's looking into PAS 2035, and Matt Allcock, who's looking at design and delivery. The format for this afternoon is that each of our speakers will be presenting for around about 10 minutes, and we'll have time at the end for a Q&A session. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box if it's a question. If you have an observation or are looking for clarity on something, put it in the chat and we'll try and answer it. The webinar recordings and slides will be available on our website, and later, after the completion of the webinar, probably in the early part of next week, you'll get an email summary of the Sustainability Week, including the links for this webinar. This will include an update of our toolkit for retrofit, which includes some multi-residential types. So I'll now hand you over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. Today, I'm going to share with you my experience in retrofit project in a more challenging setting. I will not be able to cover everything of this project just in 10 minutes, so I'm going to give you a very brief version of the project. Number 5 to 7 Belsize Grove is a block that starts its life as 2 detached Victorian villas. Belsize Grove is a street in London Borough of Camden that lies within the Belsize Park Conservation Area. The site shares a boundary with a 1960s apartment block on one side, as you can see on the left of the picture, and a similar style Victorian villa on the other side, which is similar to the property opposite to the right. The streetscape consists of a number of other sympathetic mid-1800s properties with similar height and style. The conservation area character statement mentioned that the properties were built for the newly emerging carriage-only class, which also explains the wide streetscape. The streetscape generally has a rendered facade with decorative architectural features, as the upper pictures on the screen. As you can see from the bottom picture of the facade of 5 to 7 Belsize Grove, it looks quite different. Many of the features have been lost over the years, down to what is thought to be a number of unsympathetic refurbishment works, including the linking 2 blocks into one with a recess in the middle, which give an impression of a terraced house. The character statement provides a note that it has a negative visual impact on the street. Our clients, London Borough of Camden, would like to use this building as a demonstrator project to show the possibility of the whole house deep retrofit for traditional buildings, given a lot of inner London stock is traditional or heritage. With EPC rating of units varied from D to F, Camden have applied for HDF funding, and accordingly, PAS 2035 framework compliance is required. Matt and Will address the significance of PAS 2035 later on in this session. The goal of this project is to increase the energy efficiency of the building, improve thermal comfort and occupants' health, achieve better moisture and ventilation control within the property, reduce CO2 emission and reliance on fossil fuel for heating and hot water. This is to align with the government and Camden Council carbon reduction goal. But most importantly, the work needs to help reduce residents' energy bills and fight against fuel poverty. As previously noted, the building is 2 mid-19th century 4-story mansions, which have been called by retrofit lift shops in the middle. The solid wall building is traditionally constructed with render fronts and London yellow brick stock, flank and rear. There's a number of large attractive faces, both straight and bold. A mixture of facade treatments had led to a need of innovation in the approach for any facade treatments. The building has converted to 58 bedrooms or self-containing units. As you may imagine, although the block is similarly large, 58 units means the living space are quite densely packed. This leads to each dwelling have an average of 20 square meters. With only a handful of void flats, this also means a large number of occupants to keep on site and manage during the retrofit works. In such an old, densely populated block present a number of challenges. On intrusive inspection, there's a number of defects. The retrofit and management of occupants has an increased difficulty due to inclusion of communal bathroom, which given the occupants' occupation of the buildings is heavily used and subject to increased wear and tear. There is also a defective communal ventilation system that causes moisture content issues, exacerbated by the heavily used bathroom at the end of the corridor. The building is already gas-free, and the ceiling wall about limited circulation space is already very densely packed with surfaces that we are unlikely to be able to rationalize. And there's need of renew ventilation system in the corridor, so we can't just remove the existing because there's no window or external facing walls, and it is a protected escape route, which means a surface solution is difficult to provide. A previous report has explored the option of ground source heat pump and air source heat pump, as there are extensive gardens which may able to accommodate the external units. However, after our survey, we found that both are not feasible due to the energy demand calculated based on the occupancy and the insufficient space in the ceiling void. A very fresh approach is taken. The main goal is to limit energy use as much as possible. With the electric grid decarbonized, it will reduce or even eliminate the reliance on fossil fuel in the building in the future. This includes a proposal in installing vapor permeable, high specification external wall insulation and replace all underperformed windows to a better energy performance but similar appearance windows. The building is not listed, but this is within conservation area. Naturally, there are constraints on what can be achieved with the fabric. Although it is a general risk, we have an increased input from the planning department. Camden have ensured that planning department is aware of their net zero carbon aspirations and accordingly have a pre-application procedure in place specifically for retrofit properties. An application has been submitted for the pre-app and constructive conversation in addition to the onboarding of a heritage consultant. This was key as shown in the previous slides. We are proposing to reintroduce a number of architectural features similar to the neighboring property, as you can see in the picture, that were removed as a part of previous renovation to improve the aesthetic of the building. But there's some greater technical challenge for technical risk for retrofitting. This resolves around how the buildings might act with the upgrades of envelopes. So our ventilation and heating strategy needed to fully consider this. We are surprised to collaborate on some breathable solution regarding the fabric treatments. Despite the building is not high-rise, it is densely populated. With facade treatment comes to the inevitable concern over fire safety. Right now, we have submitted a full plan application and awaiting the decision. We are in the process of preparing tender documents, but actually before we come to these, different survey and research on materials and system was conducted or commissioned, including intrusive work to ensure the existing structure and materials. We are taking steps to de-risk the above-mentioned technical challenge. Issue logs and RIT register are used as a project management tool. We have regular internal meetings and client calls. We also liaise with the supply chain to keep up to date with the cost and supplies issues. As a demonstrator project, Belsize School will be the first choice for many organizations. It is difficult to treat retrofit in terms of both building, situation, and end user that doesn't fit the typical street properties profile that we are seeing other organizations address as a pilot scheme or demonstrator project. However, we believe that Camden have made a great decision in nominating Belsize School for their initial demonstrator. As an inner London authority, Camden have a lot of 19th and turn of century stock that's incredibly difficult to treat conventionally, and requires a bespoke solution. With their ambitious choice in building, the demonstrator has potential to dictate their retrofit strategy moving forward, while proving the wider audience that either disposal or omission for program are not the only option when it comes to something requiring more than a simple Tetris archetype. In doing this also ensures the vulnerable residents are not forgotten is one of the key aims of PASS 2035, which is developing a future strategy by medium-term plan, ensuring fuel poverty is minimized by way of reducing energy bills and ensure occupants' comfort. So thank you for listening. I'm going to hand over to Ben to talk about strategic asset management.
Thank you ever so much for that, Elizabeth. That is a really good project, really interesting project. It looks like a very challenging project to work on, but fantastic nevertheless. Thanks all for tuning in. I'm here today to talk to you about strategic asset management and how it can be used to achieve our net carbon goals. So, what is strategic asset management? The RICS defines strategic asset management as the activity of aligning property assets with the strategic aims and directions of the organisation, adding both financial and non-financial value to the organisation as a result. So, zeroing in on 3 key points there. So the strategic aims, financial and non-financial value are particularly important in this statement. So this diagram here is taken from the RICS asset management cycle. It comes from the same document as that definition. And you can see this follows a very traditional way of dealing with an asset. So the top is very much based around keeping homes in good repair. And this is very much from an asset perspective rather than a whole organisational perspective. So this is then a maintenance-based system that is lifespan based and a replacement strategy as opposed to improvement based, unless you have things like UPVC windows that are replacing timber windows that become an industry standard. And then the way that that planning is dictated is through stock condition survey information generally and the capture of data on various visits. And the delivery is generally through traditional procurement routes, such as framework contract calls off, measured term contracts lasting 1 year to 3 years, some JCT intermediate contracts, etc. And then the strategy for review is largely based on further stock condition information gathering and reviewing the strategy and objectives of the asset lifespan rather than anything else. So, the challenge of net zero then, in terms of the challenges actually faced, there are a number of challenges that have come up over the past decade, really. The first is a climate emergency. So, climate and ecological emergency. By the government declaration of 74% of all authorities in the country, the UK has declared a climate emergency. The UK is required to achieve net zero by 2050. So, the next challenge is that nearly net zero, which is a 78% reduction by 2035, so 15 years earlier than 2050, in line with the Climate Change Act 2019 and 2021 respectively. The clean growth strategy requires fewer poor households to achieve EPCC by 2030. And because a lot of social housing authorities identify all of their residents as vulnerable residents where they're in social housing, this applies to most local authorities and social housing organisations. So the next challenge, and on the basis of vulnerable households, is a just transition to fuel poverty. It's all well and good installing various services in the property that reduce energy costs. However, they're not going to eliminate energy cost issues. So it's all well and good installing a heat pump, but if the occupant can't afford it, it doesn't resolve the issue. So this moves on to difficult retrofit, as Elizabeth has discussed very well in her section about bell size growth. The UK has the oldest stock in Europe and the most energy efficient stock, inefficient stock in Europe. So it's very, very difficult to achieve EPCC alone by 2035, let alone net zero by 2050. Another large challenge is stakeholder and resident engagement. So will planning be an issue? Will resident engagement be an issue? So we've previously overcome this by early engagement and appraisal, and the level of disruption can often be too much compared to component replacement. Residents can simply refuse to engage, which sets back the strategy where replacements need to be shoehorned into a programme. We've previously assisted and mitigated this by the implementation of engagement strategies and education to assist. However, dropouts still are largely inevitable. And then the final large challenge that we have is one of cost. The current environment costs are really worrying for everybody. There's no sign that the perfect storm of market factors are going to let up at the moment. And the asset management strategy could actually be the key to unlocking this. So moving on then, this calls for an all-around new strategy when it comes to asset management. So this is the previous slide, and given the challenges that we've got a new strategy that needs to be based on net zero. This then feeds into a new vision, which is net zero by 2050, addressing fuel poverty, keeping homes warm and cheap to heat. And in addition to that, something that a lot of people are glossing over when it comes to the new vision and strategy based on retrofit, fire safety and safety of the home is still an issue as well. So it's another plate for the asset manager to spin. So then this feeds into a replacement strategy that is a hybrid of component, lifespan, disposal, and whole house retrofit. So this could be a part funded development and retrofit program based on disposal, some whole house retrofit, some fabric first retrofit, some component replacement that factors into the plan. So lots of different things going on at once, feeding into that plate spinning analogy. And then that is strongly dictated not only by stock condition information, but also by EPC information and archetypal information even, where we've gone to an archetype, we understand what works in that archetype, and we can carry that forward to others rather than cloning data without quite understanding the implication of doing so. And then rather than traditional procurement routes, we start looking at hybrid procurement routes where there's joint learning. So it's based on funding, specialist contractors and long-term partnerships where none of that learning is left behind. So rather than having these 1, 2, 3 year call-off contracts that just end and get quite sour because there's no longevity of work, it's a real life partnership, and we're seeing that more and more throughout the industry. And then in terms of the circle and how this goes back in terms of the actual assessment of properties, that stock condition survey data, the archetyping data and SAP data is still considered. However, monitoring data is also now considered as well, making sure that this retrofit has actually worked for the property, making sure that the home is comfortable, the home is safe. So in terms of how that asset management works financially, and I will give you quite a caveat here, you can see a graph that gives some rough costs. This data isn't extracted from a particular source, it is theoretical. It's prepared using a very basic model of 2,000 units and assumed costs. This basic strategy accumulated the cost of retrofit over the course of the next 28 years to 2050. It allows for a 1% disposal rate, which feeds into the asset management process and allows for a comparison. So it allows a nominal cost that is absorbed by retrofit activity when taken. So you can see that we've got 3 different columns here. One is for whole house retrofit, and that's in red. One is for fabric first retrofit, so medium term plan retrofit, which is in yellow. And the green signifies a medium term retrofit strategy, which includes for disposals. You can see that undertaking full house retrofit is much more expensive in the first instance than carrying out a medium term plan retrofit that bases itself on fabric first. This is because, simply put, you're putting more components into the building. But as you look at this graph over the years, that gap decreases between whole house retrofit and medium term plan, but never quite closes. And that's because if you're putting in a service strategy at the same time as a fabric strategy, you're effectively giving yourself a liability that you have to continuously pay for and maintain and then reinstall further down the line. So the emphasis of medium-term plan and fabric first strategy is that you treat the fabric, which is quite often the hardest part of the building to treat. and enable future services to be installed in the building while maintaining the services that are already in the building and exhausting their lifespan. By doing this, you're not only saving money through maintenance and through installation, but you're also saving carbon, arguably, because you've not got the embodied carbon of throwing away something that has plenty of asset life left in it, in addition to having the embodied carbon of a brand new services replacement. So, as you can see, the green bar, which we haven't touched on, is for disposal. This largely just tracks exactly what the medium-term plan is doing. However, falls slightly shorter than that because you're effectively taking some money from that asset, reinvesting it into your medium-term plan where you've got a disposal. So moving on, some of the issues that we're coming across in terms of challenges to actually implement an asset management strategy are data quality issues. So from our experience, the data held by a lot of organisations on their stock is usually quite inconsistent and needs to be addressed at source during the vision forming stage of an asset management strategy. So this is quite often missing stock condition data, inadequate or incomplete, sometimes cloned, sometimes built on assumptions around what should be in the property rather than what actually is in the property. There is also an absence of vital information on the assets such as EPC and SAP data, generally undertaken on the basis of an RD SAP calculation. And a lot of this then provides misleading data. So RD SAP, quite often what we see when we're addressing these SAP calculations are largely exactly the same property with 4 or 5 different SAP scores, which are completely misleading to what may or may not work in that property. And in addition to that, the formulation of cost data that is based on old costs. So if you have old costs that you're basing your strategy on, it's never going to be adequately financially forecast, which means that you are effectively falling behind on what your investment strategy is going to be as part of that asset management strategy. So in terms of setting that corporate vision, there are lots of different items that are important in forming that corporate vision. So asset management takes a holistic view of buildings and it satisfies all the competing areas of driving procurement. So this is fire safety, safe homes, quality, retrofit, affordable. So we've talked about that component replacement, thermal comfort and fuel affordability, but we need to also incorporate best value, compliance, building safety and resident satisfaction as part of that corporate vision. The challenge for the asset manager lies in how best to prioritise the works that are required. Over the last few years, building owners' strategy has been very reactive as they navigate the ever-changing landscape of various different regulations and legislations that have been brought in, with the main goal being to ensure that they satisfy their clients. So as you can see, you've got lots of different items there, but the key driver in all of those items is always going to be the accuracy of data. So unless that data is accurate, it is incredibly difficult to formulate your asset management strategy. Thanks ever so much for listening, and I'm now going to hand you over to Matt Allcock and Will Gregory.
Thank you very much, Ben. Matt and I are now going to provide an overview of the PAS 2035 standard for whole house retrofitting domestic properties in the UK. We feel that an understanding of PAS 2035 is crucial as part of the practical preparation for retrofit. PAS 2035 has been introduced in response to the failure of the Green Deal and the Each Home Counts review carried out by the UK government in 2015. This was a comprehensive review of the energy efficiency sector, which resulted in a call for the industry-wide code of practice for retrofitting domestic properties and a universally recognised quality standard in the form of Trustmark. We're going to outline some of the PAS 2035 processes through the life cycle of a project, and if required, further reading around this can be provided through our own retrofit toolkit, which is being relaunched this week following several updates. When working on PAS 2035 retrofit projects, having an awareness of the 6 core principles will help you understand the process, but will also support you in decision making when looking at your existing stock. The 6 core principles are on the screen in front of you and include professional accountability. So this means the project team having appropriate qualifications, skill and experience. A whole house retrofit approach, so looking at retrofitting homes as a whole system over time and not just individual elements. A bespoke approach to projects, so while you may start off with a strategy looking at different archetypes and properties as a whole, you will need to look at individual properties on a bespoke nature and preparing bespoke designs. When constructing, it's important that when we're building, we build tight and ventilate right. So this means that if we're introducing measures, we need to address the ventilation of properties as well to avoid future issues and defects. There's a big emphasis on quality in past 2035, and this is looking at reducing defects in the long term again, and improving efficiency of buildings. And then one of the key core principles is the fabric first retrofit approach, so looking at improving the thermal performance of properties before introducing low carbon measures. The Retrofit Academy has produced a process map, which is on the screen now, which tells or demonstrates the journey through a past 2035 compliant project. There are 6 key steps that are outlined in this process, which starts off at project inception, so establishing the brief, project team, and so on. We've then got a past 2035 risk assessment, which determines which pathway you then proceed on the project. And I'll go into a bit more about that shortly. The third step is then assessment of the dwellings involved in the project, but then looking ahead at improvement options and medium-term plans. The fourth step then looks at designing the scheme based on the improvement option, and then looking at delivering the project in a compliant past 2030 approach, which is different from the past 2035 standard and is focused on the installation on site. And the final step is monitoring and evaluation, and this is really important for as we as an industry progress through the retrofit journey and ensuring that we learn lessons through projects. Okay, so after we've established a project team and project inception, then it's important that the risk assessment is carried out on the project. This is based on 5 criteria on the screen now. Some of these are relatively straightforward to do, such as the number of dwellings in the project and the number of measures being introduced. But some of the criteria, particularly criteria 4, require a little bit more in-depth review. This is a combination of measures, and to support this, there is a measures interaction matrix available. So I appreciate the image on the right-hand side. The text is a bit small, so I've tried to zoom in on one portion of that to make it clearer. But essentially, that matrix shows the same measures across the top and then diagonally underneath as well. Each of the measures is color-coded in their interaction with each other. The color coding key is shown on the screen now and includes red, amber, yellow, and green. So where the green measures are indicated, those measures don't interact with each other and therefore are independent. Yellow means they interact and may connect and require some construction detail between them. Amber means they will interact and will require complementary specifications. So example down there on the screen, heating controls and insulation upgrades will need to be carefully considered. And the red indication on the matrix basically means those measures shouldn't be introduced together. Once the risk assessment is complete, we're then able to establish which pathway through past 2035 is required, and this is either a low risk, medium risk, or high risk project. This risk assessment will then inform the roles and responsibilities required on the project. So hopefully you can see down the left-hand side of that table, we've got assess project risk, low, medium, and high. And as you can move through, we've got the assessment strategy design and specification, installation, handover, monitoring, evaluation columns. You'll see coming up on a number of the roles, the retrofit coordinator, but actually as you move through the risk level of a project, the retrofit coordinator is supported more and more by separate assessors and designers. The retrofit coordinator, as I mentioned on the previous slide, is a role specifically created for the PAS 2035 approach and is required for each of the low, medium and high risk pathways, as I've just said. It's responsibility of the retrofit coordinator to ensure all elements of domestic retrofit are properly managed and coordinated, and that a cohesive retrofit plan is designed and implemented. This will include supporting the assessor, designer, installer and evaluator through the varying stages of the project, ensuring compliance with PAS 2035. To become a retrofit coordinator, a level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination and risk management is required, which is available through the Retrofit Academy. At Baillie Garner, we have provided staff with in-house PAS 2035 awareness training, but also have 5 qualified retrofit coordinators across both our London and Midlands office, and a further 10 are currently undergoing the training, with a view to have 15 fully qualified retrofit coordinators by August in advance of the Wave 2 SHDF funding. It's also worth noting that to access this funding stream, the appointment of a qualified retrofit coordinator on projects will be required. The final slide I'm going to talk through to you is after you've carried out the risk assessment on projects and established the roles and responsibilities, we then look at understanding the baseline EPC of properties by carrying out SAP assessments. This table is taken from our retrofit toolkit and is an archetype example, which is a D-rated property at baseline EPC. The retrofit coordinator, along with the designer and the assessor, will then work up a series of measures which are indicated below under the upgrades column. And you can see here, this has been taken in a fabric first approach with IWI and triple glazing being introduced initially. This model then works up the EPC rating, and you can see where it tips over from a D to a C, but also provides detail on the space heating and demand as well, along with some estimated costings. I'm now going to hand over to Matt to talk us through some design and on-site challenges with the PAS 2035 retrofit approach.
Great, thank you, Will. So the title of this section of the presentation is PAS 2035, PAS Present and Future. As well as an opportunity for a pun, I hope the title serves to build on the narrative developed by the first speakers and help show a kind of retrofit timeline. PAS 2035 is the new whole house deep retrofit or single or multiple measure standard that aims to address deficiencies of historical retrofit projects and promote and nurture best practice in this most critical of programs, retrofitting our existing housing stock and rapidly stemming ecologically and biodiversity damaging human-derived carbon emissions. So to start in the PAS or past, problem with some previous retrofits was a failure to address existing building defects prior to the retrofit upgrade. Most critical to PAS 2035 are defects such as damp, cracking and moisture and ventilation control. If pre-existing defects such as these are not remedied or attended to by the works, there is the increased risk of baked-in defects causing further issues down the line, including non-compliance with the standard. This highlights the importance of early engagement of the retrofit assessor under the stewardship of the retrofit coordinator to survey and collect existing property data and commence a suitable level of defect diagnosis. This pre-works process is defined in the standard and requires a large amount of work up front. Like many a construction project, early efforts reap later rewards. Have you undertaken a sufficient level of opening up and initial survey work to mitigate risk when on site? Has budget been apportioned suitably? Has the procurement approach fostered a partnering ethos? Two defects witnessed once these energy-sprung retrofit works had commenced on site are shown in this slide. First image shows an infilled section of foundation on a Unity type concrete frame system build, which required structural reinforcing and which caused issue with fixing of external wall insulation. Second image shows hidden electrical cables in a cavity, which had an impact on proposals for a cavity fill. Both these issues were highlighted once the contractor was already on site, causing additional cost and delay, and which might have been uncovered with further early survey work. In any event, PAS 2035 requires the right level of detail to be coordinated to ensure the retrofit design, effectiveness of installed measures, and outcomes for both property and residents are as best they can be, durable, efficient, lasting, and user-friendly. On site, the PAS 2035 retrofit coordinator has a duty to oversee quality and ensure the PAS 2030 accredited installers are following the approved retrofit design and PAS process. The images on this slide show key areas of the PAS retrofit: airtightness and insulation, among others. With the pressures of time, cost, weather, and other factors such as residents in situ, a clear and well-defined process of quality management is essential. Project team must buy into this from both client and contractor side, and the retrofit coordinator can help achieve this. If airtight tape is not applied correctly, too heavily relied on, or if insulation boards are not fixed with the correct adhesive, jointing compound, and mechanical fixings, the risk of a performance gap so often seen on past projects becomes heightened. Scaffolding should be available to check critical junctions and hold points established and followed from the outset to sign off key stages. Before starting on site, a great deal of work goes into producing a specification and tender pack, which is something we specialise in at Bailey Garner. Key clauses establishing requirements for compliance with PAS 2035 and PAS 2030 should be written into the specification, be consistent across documents, clear on what potential derogations might be available, if any, and underline the overriding performance outcomes alongside critical considerations such as funding goals and client requirements. Clauses should note the PAS 2035 process to be followed and requirement to pay particular attention to on-site detailing and quality of installation. This detail can help the contractor price and the client budget. Now, apologies, the text on this slide is very small when you're not expected to read it. Following on from Will's slides on the retrofit coordinator pre-works, a little about mid and post-works responsibilities. The project risk path will determine some of the additional requirements mid-works, such as risk path C requiring a mid-works air pressure test. Process map in the image lays out in detail the requirements for the RC to follow, mid and post-works. These relate to coordinating between on-site works and the retrofit designer and retrofit assessor in the case of any design changes or particular technical issues, observing compliance of installation, witnessing, testing and commissioning and overseeing handover, offering retrofit advice to residents, undertaking or coordinating evaluation and monitoring, certifying compliance and collating project documentation. A retrofit coordinator is a project manager, building surveyor and PAS 2035 specialist. And in Bailey Garner, we offer a multidisciplinary service to integrate these. Also, data should be uploaded to Trustmark Data Warehouse, which provides a central platform for completed projects and underwrites the quality mark of retrofit under PAS 2035. Other industry quality schemes such as MCS, SWIGA and SIGA feed into this. One gripe aimed at PAS 2035 is how it can inflate costs. At Bailey Garner, we've used the practical site experience to review key areas where cost savings might be found in the works and design. Specifying a thinner profile insulation might avoid cost in having to extend a projecting protective roof required for PAS 2035 compliance. Evaluation of the temperature factor of the ground floor junction can determine the need to extend EWI to the footings or not. Ventilation might be adequately distributed via centralized demand controlled extract as opposed to a full MVHR system. Clearly, longer and medium-term considerations are critical too, and to avoid future rework. So PAS 2035 critically looks to the future. In the provision and development of a medium-term plan, the client can plan and program for the future of its asset. Factors such as budget, funding, residence, asset strategy, plan maintenance programs, and performance drivers contribute to the discussion on what measures be programmed when, whether a deep whole house, no regrets approach or a single few measures policy is preferable. There are tools from both accreditation providers, the Retrofit Academy and Elmhurst Energy, as in this slide, that allow the retrofit coordinator, retrofit designer and retrofit assessor to formulate a suitable medium-term plan and crystal ball gaze on what might happen in future. Critical to these decisions and discussions are considerations as to sequencing of works, later impacts of retrofitted measures, resident movements and government policy. So what of the future? Well, to misquote William Gibson, the future is already here, it's just not evenly retrofitted yet. And there are tools that will hopefully redress this. Approved document Z on whole life carbon has been proposed with the backing of industry to tackle embodied carbon emissions, so long an oversight. The RICS Institute of Chartered Surveyors brought out its Royal Whole Life Carbon Assessment Professional Statement back in 2017 and has been developing an online carbon database. This standard has recently been recommended by MPs to form the basis for mandatory whole life carbon assessments for new buildings. And accreditations such as B Corp offer designations for business committed to net zero by 2030. But as is the way in the construction sector, progress never comes easy. So Bailey Garner is here to help clients and contractors in funding bids. We can use our past experience of 40 odd years in facilitating and overseeing bids, identifying key elements of the retrofit question in SHDF Wave 2 bids, what content to include and how to frame the precise answer as an integrated, successful and collaborative project team. Thank you for listening. Please do get in touch.
Well, that was great. And thanks very much to all the presenters there. Really good and great to see the story through those presentations lead to practical implications on site, which is where it all really happens. So we had a number of questions come in through the chat. I'm going to start with the second one that came in and then wrap some of the cost questions up together. So there's an anonymous attendee, and thanks for Paul for not being anonymous, but what is the thinking on properties like these? And I think this relates back to Elizabeth's presentation, where we can only get to an EPC Band C within current constraints of building construction and planning requirements. Elizabeth, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I would like to take this. Yes, so we have an issue with we are only able to achieve an EPC Band C, or some of the units may be able to achieve Band B. Because of the size of the unit, that affects the EPC rating. That's however measure that we put on top of the building, they have a very minimal impact to the EPC score. But I think the goal here is to reduce the energy bills and reduce the heat demand of the property to heat up, and to provide occupants confidence. And with what I talk about is the decarbonize of the electric grid, that we are still able to achieve a net zero for this property without putting on top of the ground source heat pump that needs to put a lot of efforts to refrigerate the whole properties. Those resources may be able to use on other properties that we can do more retrofit properties. We can do more retrofit work to benefit other residents as well.
Okay, thanks. And there's another question just, I think, related to the same thing as the cost of that particular demonstrator project, both pre-work and build cost. I don't know, I know Ben's involved in that project as well. Do you want to take that one?
Of course, no problem at all. So Belsize Grove isn't currently on site yet. We are just drawing up the end of the specification to release it into market so we can get some live tenders back. In terms of survey work, we are sitting at approximately 25k in terms of survey work. Got to be very careful about how much information I do actually give you. It is a live project, obviously, but it averages out under £500 per unit in terms of survey work.
Okay, and then there's another question on costs coming, and then we'll move on to some of the others. The full house retrofit costs, are they current and based on examples of costs by installers? Will, do you want to take that one? Start off and then anyone else throw in?
So I think, was that in relation to the costs on the asset management graph?
I was going to say, I think that might be some of the costs that are on my graph.
Okay, you take that one then, thank you.
No problem at all. So getting some scrutiny on my graph, as may be expected. So as I did caveat, the costs are very high level, and it's to kind of provide that guidance of where retrofit sits in terms of medium plan and whole house. However, the costs are based on live tender costs that we're seeing back from market for whole house retrofit. These are very recent costs that we're getting back following the release and return of some tenders over the last 2 months. So just for clarity, these tenders were for a relatively small scale retrofit, so less than 30 properties on this retrofit scheme, fully designed option, so no D&B contract involved, full stage 4 design out to tender, and the returns were averaging out at about 115k a property, and that is for an air source heat pump, full service approach, so solar PV on the roof as well, EWI, centralized MEV system, double glazing, so a full house system. It's pretty conventional in terms of full house system, and not only is it conventional in terms of full house system, it's also quite conventional in terms of the dwelling type as well. A few bungalows in there, kind of mid-terrace and end of terrace 2-story dwellings. So they're the sort of costs that we're basing that graph on. You can see 115k a property is largely unsustainable, which is why we are starting to gear towards offering advice around that medium-term strategy and exhausting the services that are in place before actually moving on to a full house approach.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Rose Dickinson, you're on the call. I think you have your hand up, but if you could put your query or question in the Q&A, we'll answer it. So just staying briefly, Ben, with you, how can a strategic asset management plan deal with the massive costs of retrofit now being supercharged by build cost inflation? And then we've heard about cost, which is the biggest issue. We'll move on to some of the other. You're mute, Ben.
There's always one, isn't there? I think if the asset management strategy values carbon through energy efficient measures, which have an impact on EPC and more importantly, the heat demand of the building as well, and ties these to a longer term associated component replacement, the money can actually be spread thinner over the course of the asset's life, but have a greater effect on the homes, if that makes sense. So you're effectively having to pay for less new things because you're having to also so having to pay for less new things by maintaining something that you've already got in the property. But by doing this, the strategy doesn't throw components and systems way early as well. So you're always going to have that maintenance cost, but you've not got the renewal cost associated to that. And conversely, you then having the carbon effectiveness with that cost effectiveness because it doesn't lose that embodied carbon that I'd referred to. So you're not losing embodied carbon by throwing away a component that's only a few years old and then investing all that new embodied carbon into a new, I don't know, heat pump or GSHP system where you've got to manufacture lots and lots of new parts and get them imported halfway across the globe as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben. So there's a question here. The new Part F ventilation requirement for new windows, will this undermine the benefits of insulation and thermal improvements to the property? With ventilation being such a critical part of PAS, Matt or Will, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm happy.
Okay, yeah, give it a go.
Don't fight over it.
Well, it's a good question. My understanding is the new Part F is very much about ways of getting stale, contaminated bad air out of the property and providing sufficient supply air to the sort of level required by a more sort of modern dwelling. And I would say, in fact, that the PAS 2035 requirements and those new requirements actually coincide rather than conflict, because PAS 2035 is all about dealing with any issues with poor air quality internally and providing a system that ensures adequate supply air as well as exhausting air from the wet rooms. And also, as part of PAS 2035 compliance, you are required to assess the overheating element as well, which I think forms part of the new Part F, or at least links to it in the Part O document. So you're required to show that if you're putting on a good deal of new insulation and making the property thermally improved and generally pretty airtight, then you need to look at issues such as overheating, solar glare, your orientation of the building, how that's affecting the temperatures internally as well. So I would say that PAS 2035 can actually help meet those requirements, new requirements, better.
And Will, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it just to add on to Matt, really, I think a lot of the buildings that are going to be retrofitted will naturally be leaky to start with, and we're going to be taking away that by improving the insulation and thermal performance. So I think the introduction of the trickle vents and things like that to the windows will form part of that ventilation strategy, which I think, John, you put on the chat is one of the crucial parts of retrofit and the PAS 2035 approach. So I think it can work in harmony with it.
Okay, so open question to everyone, because you've all touched on it. Feedback on PAS 2035 is that it's adding additional cost or adding cost and complexity to retrofit projects. Is that the case? Question.
Do you want me to start with that one, John?
Yeah, go on then.
I think obviously the PAS 2035 process and the retrofit agenda is relatively new to most organisations, and that will naturally come with a learning process. Things may take more time, and that could subsequently come with some additional costs. I think there's opportunities for that to be made more efficient, and that's where kind of services with contract administration could be overlapped to try and get some efficiencies there. But I also think actually the PAS 2035 approach and the focus on quality and getting things right will hopefully in the long term avoid having to go and rectify subsequent defects and issues with the work. So I think with a longer term view, it will be beneficial from a cost point of view.
And Elizabeth, do you think that's the case in the retrofit of the historic and period buildings that we've been involved in?
I think because PAS actually very comprehensive, like we have to do the survey beforehand. So it's actually put the cost, maybe put it up front, but at the same time, we have to do those survey anyway in the project. So we are not putting the risk during the construction period and just make the construction period longer. So it actually is a de-risking factor here.
Okay, fine. And anyone else got anything to feedback on that one? Okay, Ben, he's got his hand up.
I've got two hands up. I think I fully appreciate that. It does feel a lot like it's just an additional cost that you're throwing at something. However, with a lot of these projects, I think it's best not to lose sight that generally you're going to be employing probably a contract administrator anyway and a design team to design something. The costs, when you look at it holistically, aren't too far away from that. But another item perhaps not to lose sight on is what was happening with energy efficient measures as recently as 3 years ago, having a lot of mis-selling of energy efficient measures, especially external wall insulation and solar PV. What this does is react to the review of that and put a framework in place just to ensure that that doesn't happen. It regulates the industry, and it's really important for the industry to have that regulation.
Okay, great. And leading on to that, I think we've kind of touched on it there, and it's a fundamental thing coming through is the right balance between upfront costs of investigation and survey versus the variations on site that Matt referenced in his presentation. Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I'll pick that up. So yeah, just to reiterate what Elizabeth said really about the de-risking element. I think, yeah, you're very much taking out quite significant, potentially significant risks from the actual build program. Clearly any delay or significant issues once on site is going to incur potential additional preliminary costs and delay costs from the contractor. So it's very much an element of looking holistically at those risks from the start and trying to sort of remove them and reduce them as much as you possibly can. I think, yeah, that there are more requirements in terms of survey work to ensure compliance with the PAS 2035 standard. And I think really the starting point is the data you hold, because I think a lot of problems or a lot of costs can be avoided if there's a good set of data to begin with, and you're not trying to play catch up on stuff that wasn't done in the past, or you can find efficiencies and avoid sort of rework or surveyors having to go out more than once and things like that. So I think that initial data analysis is so critical to the whole process, and that's helped if you've got a sort of supportive framework or sort of partnering arrangement or other stakeholders who can assist you in doing that. And I think if that's done well, then there'll be a much leaner and cleaner build program and reduce costs as a result of that. And adding to what some others said about longer term as well, really what PAS is looking at doing is that holistic approach to remedy defects, to put the property in a good state of repair, effectively address the property as a whole so that it is in better nick going forward, and it's sort of future proof to deal with the climate and ecological emergency. So it might seem like there is more cost. I think, as others have said, there are efficiencies to be found, and it's a new standard, and people are still learning on that. But I think if you take a longer term view, it's a beneficial investment.
Anyone else want to add to that? I've got a question of my own, if anyone else wants to add to it. Anyone else? Okay. So archetyping, design and build, NEC contracts, EPC data, big problem for industry, stockholding landlords. Can we solve it? Big question. Anyone want to take that one on just in the last couple of minutes? Go on, Ben.
Yeah, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head and probably addressed the issues that I was trying to address in my strategic asset management section a lot more succinctly than I did, John, to be honest with you. There is a huge challenge at the moment for asset management generally, and it isn't just retrofit, it's across the board of everything. And I think the two most important aspects of it are data, as Matt quite rightly refers to, but in addition to that, it's ensuring that the correct people are engaged with that strategy as well. So that can mean residents, that can mean planning departments, that can mean other departments internally. It's about having a joined up strategy rather than working in silos as much as anything else, I think.
Okay, and we've got a couple of late questions coming actually. Really is resident education and resident involvement and the best results. Does anyone want to just pick that up as the last point before we finish?
Yes. I mean, there's been a lot of really good publications and recommendations brought out by the Construction Leadership Council and others recently about, supply chain issues, getting people trained, skills, etc. I'm not sure whether the idea of a sort of residents group or sort of almost like a sort of citizens assembly type arrangement where residents come together and talk about the whole process and how it's going to work for them would be something to stress more or bring into the conversation. Clearly, as identified by those two questions, that residents are fundamental to the success of the project, both starting out so you don't have dropouts, and then also looking further into the future so they understand how the property operates and the sort of the discussion about behaviour and culture is had as well. So maybe that's a possibility. Stakeholders might be able to form resident interest groups and roll that out across a wider location, and that might help iron out some of those challenges with the resident side of things.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I mean, thanks for a great Q&A there as well, and hopefully everyone found that of interest. We're just coming up to the end of the session now. There were a couple of questions we didn't quite get to, so those will be addressed in the wash up, where we'll be publishing all the QA and all the chat alongside the webinar and the webinar recording and the slides. So for those of you on the call, I'd just really like to thank you for your attendance. And yeah, it's been great having you along, even though we can't see you all. And yeah, thanks to the panelists as well. Great presentations there. So hope you all enjoy the rest of the sunny weather. Thanks very much.